I want to spend a few minutes talking about what we perceive as the environmental public health challenges associated with developing the unconventional resource. Of course, Alan already did a yeoman's job in talking about many of the issues associated with producing the product. And I would say that Environmental Defense Fund really has two priorities here, right? The first is how do we minimize the risks to public health and the environment associated with producing the product. And then the second challenge, which is broader than unconventional oil and gas development itself, is how do we deal with emissions of methane across the natural gas supply chain from well to burner tip. So usually when I come and speak to an audience, I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the challenges associated with producing the product. Alan did a very good job of doing that today, so I'm going to buzz right by this graphic here, which is a nice little cartoon, I think, in a way to kind of visualize for a lay audience what some of the challenges are, and go right into talking about methane. That second issue that's very important to us. This literally was an issue that was invisible to the public and frankly to the industry not too long ago. It has become a much more visible issue, in part because there is so much more focus in Washington and elsewhere on climate change and the role that methane plays in climate change, and I'll spend a few minutes talking about that. But it's also become visible because, frankly, the technology is now getting to the point where people can go out with their infrared cameras and actually look at sites. So here's a site over here, gas storage tank, beautiful sunny day, looks perfect. Okay, now we put the infrared camera on it and look what's going on there. Okay, I mean, this really is an example of a problem that you don't know you have it until you actually go look for it. And up until this point, there's been very little incentive on the part of companies to go look for it. And frankly, up until this point, the public at large has not had the technology to be able to look for it, but that's all changing. So why is methane so important? Most people in this room know that methane is itself a greenhouse gas. And in fact, it is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. This cartoon simply represents the fact that CH4, methane, is far more effective at trapping the heat that's radiating off of the Earth than carbon dioxide. It's far more effective. Now, it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere. The challenging thing about carbon dioxide is once it's in the atmosphere, it stays there. Okay, there is a certain amount of carbon dioxide that precipitates out into the oceans eventually. There is some that is taken up by plant life, but at the rates at which we're putting it into the atmosphere today, okay, we are putting a lot that is staying up in the atmosphere for literally centuries. Methane isn't like that. Methane will break down in the atmosphere, and it might be gone in 12 years' time. Okay? But for the period of time that that molecule is in the atmosphere, it is far more effective at trapping the Earth's heat than carbon dioxide is. So beyond that simple sort of scientific fact, there's been work done to try to understand, okay, so given that, what is the role of methane and other similar types of gases called short-term climate forcers in the phenomena of climate change? Right? Historically, the way we've understood the challenge of climate change is that we need to slow the rate of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in order to slow or stop the phenomena of warming over time. And that's true. Okay? But what we've learned about the short-term climate forcers is although they don't stay in the atmosphere for very long, for the time that they're there, they are very effective at trapping the Earth's heat. And in fact, there is a role that they play in accelerating the rate of change. And so this is a chart that came out of a study by Schumacher et al. This was published in the journal Science in December of 2013. The question, what role for short-lived climate pollutants in mitigation policy? And the study came to the conclusion that If you only reduce short-term climate forcers, you get a nice reduction in the rate of warming in the short term, but over the long term, much higher warming than if you controlled carbon dioxide. If you only work to control carbon dioxide, right, you had much more warming in the earlier years. And so the optimum strategy is to do both. Right? So this isn't a question of, hey, should we focus only on methane emissions and other short-term climate forcers? Should we focus on carbon dioxide? What this study is suggesting is that what we really need to do for an effective strategy to combat climate change is really get after both of these things at the same time. And based on this work and work through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we've learned that methane itself is probably responsible for about 25% of the warming that we're currently experiencing today. So that short-term effect is very powerful. The other piece of this that I wanted to relate to you is my colleague Ramon Alvarez taking into consideration our understanding about methane and its role in climate, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This was in April of 2012, in which we attempted to try to understand the question about, is natural gas better for the climate than coal or oil? The answer to that question comes down to how much of methane is being lost during the production, transportation, and distribution process. Ramon's analysis came to the conclusion that a leak rate of about 2.7% across the natural gas supply chain was the break-even point for the comparison between natural gas and coal. In other words, a leak rate of 2.8% or above would mean that natural gas actually is worse for the climate than coal, certainly in the short term, and that for vehicles, in this case heavy-duty diesel vehicles, the leak rate would have to be at or below 0.8% in order for us to be able to say with confidence that substituting natural gas for diesel fuel provided a net climate benefit in all time frames. The Environmental Protection Agency today estimates that the leak rate across the supply chain is somewhere between 1.2, 1.5%. Right? So if you thought that EPA's estimates were correct, right, in the framework of this paper, you could be reasonably assured that our switch away from from coal to natural gas was providing net benefits to the climate. We'd be less confident that state policies to encourage conversion to natural gas vehicles would be providing a net climate benefit. Okay. Now, there is a lot of debate about just exactly how much product is being lost across the natural gas supply chain. Right? And this goes back to my earlier point, right? Up until this science work on these kinds of questions, there was very little incentive other than natural economic incentive that the industry has to try to capture leaks. There was very little incentive to go out and really try to understand with rigor what the leak rate is across the natural gas supply chain. So EPA's got a set of estimates based on data that's been reported to it and calculations that they do. There's been a wide variety of papers that have been published. We have sought to engage industry on this question and are in the process of working with industry across the natural gas supply chain, producers, gathering and processing, transmission and storage, local distribution. We even have a study underway looking at natural gas vehicles and fueling stations, a sector that's never even been studied before. And the whole purpose of this work is to try to get better data from the field as to how much product is being lost at each point in the value chain. This study is being done in partnership with the University of Texas, these two here with Colorado State University, this one with Washington State University, this one with University of West Virginia. So in each case, we've partnered with a major research university that's got competency in the area. The protocols that we use to gather the data are peer-reviewed. the interpretation of the results are peer reviewed, and then the papers are submitted to peer reviewed journals. And so this is really an effort to try to be very rigorous about the data, because we think that better data makes better policy. At the same time that we are going out into the field and actually going to sources and doing emissions monitoring, we're also experimenting with new ways of gathering data through things like methane sensors that are attached to aircraft. And so we have been sponsoring a series of studies in which we've been flying over basins to get methane readings at that level, right? What we're finding so far is that the results that we get from the aircraft flights tend to bias high. These tend to bias low. But we have enough data now from doing both bottom-up and top-down analyses, studies, that we're beginning to get a sense as to how to reconcile the two data. And what the conclusion that we're coming to is that there's no one methodology that is the definitive statement about what emissions are coming from any particular sector. That it's actually using both methodologies creates complementary views that can help give you a more robust picture of emissions from any one of these sectors than you would get by doing one method or the other alone. What we're learning is a couple of things. First of all is that we are seeing, for example, in the University of Texas study on production, we're seeing that there are technologies that can be incredibly effective at reducing methane emissions when they're deployed. So now the question is how widely deployed are those technologies? Another thing that we're learning from these studies is that even when you have good technology in place, there is what we call a fat tail issue. That is, a discrete number of sources are usually responsible for a significant fraction of the total emissions we survey. In some cases, it might be 10% of the sources yield 40% of the emissions that we survey. In other cases, it might be 5% of the sources and 30% of the emissions. It sort of varies from study to study, but you see that consistent pattern, right? And so what that suggests to us from a policy standpoint is that you want to focus a certain amount of your time and attention making sure you have the right control equipment in place, and then you want to make sure that you have policies in place to make sure that that equipment is being operated and maintained properly. Simultaneous to doing the study work, we have also been partnering with ICF International to better understand what are the range of control technologies and operating practices that currently exist in industry today, and how effective are those technologies and practices at reducing emissions. This is a study that ICF published in March of 2014. It's available on our website. There's the site. And what this study essentially concluded is a few very important things. First of all, ICF concluded that we could make a 40% reduction in methane emissions across the natural gas supply chain, basically from well to burner tip, 40% reduction for about a penny per 1,000 cubic feet of gas produced. Now that's not any one company's compliance cost, right? But if you're taking a step back and you're thinking of this from a societal standpoint, right, this is an incredibly effective set of strategies for virtually no money. 40% reduction, penny per 1,000 cubic feet of gas produced. The opportunities range across the supply chain. Some of them have net payback because, of course, after all, the gas that you're saving can be delivered back into the marketplace for a return on investment. That's not to say that there isn't an opportunity cost. In fact, one of the reasons why we believe that industry isn't doing more to collect leaks is precisely because there is an opportunity cost. Simply because the technology has a 9 or 10% return on investment doesn't necessarily mean that when it comes time to allocating capital, the capital won't flow to developing new wells where the return might be 20 or 30% return, right? So that's the reason why we need to have regulation, even in the case where there is net payback. But some of these technologies really will cost industry a certain amount of money to realize. But we think nonetheless it is incredibly important and valuable to do so, first of all because it is the right thing to do in terms of the climate. Second of all, because methane is often accompanied by other air pollutants, volatile organic compounds, hazardous air pollutants, and so there can be very important local air quality benefits that come along when you do these kinds of measures at sites. And frankly, I think that there is a piece of this which speaks to public confidence and public trust. Right? We've talked today about the burden that unconventional oil and gas development, and frankly all oil and gas development, has on the landscape and on communities where it's taking place. We firmly believe that one of the ways in which you build trust within the community is to be able to provide them with reasonable assurance that if the community is going to undertake burdens in order to produce the product, that industry is going to do, and government is going to do all that it can to make sure that those burdens weren't simply rewarded by waste of product, right? That if you're going to ask the communities to undertake the burdens associated with production, it's going to be for a reason, okay? The final point that I would make here with this work is that we now are waiting for the federal EPA to make some decisions, probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, about exactly whether and how to regulate from this sector. So you'll see in the next 2 or 3 weeks, most likely, some announcements from the administration about what they intend to do next. What I can also tell you, though, is that quite apart from what the federal government is currently doing, or thinking of doing, states have already started to embrace this challenge. Colorado, for example, has a hydrocarbon regulation which regulates all hydrocarbons coming from production and gathering systems. And, right, based on some of the work that we have done, one of the key components of that hydrocarbon rule is actually an emphasis on leak detection, leak detection and repair. Because again, having the right technology in place is one part of the challenge. Making sure that it's operated and maintained properly is another part of the challenge. And I'll stop there and look forward to discussing this during the Q&A.